heart of America, where small towns carried their secrets like old scars, there stood a house that people passed with hurried steps and lowered voices, a house whose windows seemed to breathe in the night, and whose walls were whispered to remember every scream that had ever echoed inside. And though outsiders dismissed it as a tale spun to frighten children, the locals knew that within its rotting frame lay a story soaked in blood, injustice, and the kind of revenge that did not sleep. For this was the Axe Murder House, a place cursed not just by the violent deaths that occurred within its wooden bones, but by the truth that the world never fully wanted to face, a truth born from the hunger of power, the weight of prejudice, and the silence of those who chose comfort over justice. And as the wind moved through the broken boards, it seemed to carry voices. Voices of the wronged. Voices that would not let the earth rest until the living were forced to remember. For in that house, tragedy was not a single night's madness, but the slow-burning outcome of betrayal, lies, and the unchecked cruelty of men. And so the story began on an evening that should have been ordinary, when laughter of a family turned into cries swallowed by the dark, when steel met flesh in the quiet hours before dawn, and when the ground beneath the house drank more than it could ever give back. But while many claimed the killer slipped away unnoticed, vanishing into history with the names of the dead etched into stone, there was something deeper lingering in that house, a presence that carried the shape of rage, not from the murderer, but from the souls who had been silenced. Children whose lives were stolen before they bloomed, a mother who tried to shield them, a father whose face was the last to fall, all left behind to haunt not in search of peace, but in demand of reckoning. And that demand twisted into a power so strong it seeped through the years, bending the fates of all who entered, reaching into their minds, showing them images that were not theirs yet burned like memory. Because the house itself had become more than wood and stone, it had become a vessel of revenge, not against the murderer alone, but against the system that failed to protect the innocent. The neighbors who looked away, the officials who silenced questions, and the society that allowed justice to rot in the soil. And as decades passed, the Axe Murder House turned into both a warning and a curse, a place where curiosity seekers stumbled into nightmares they could not explain, where skeptics left pale and broken, where whispers grew louder until silence became unbearable. For inside those walls time bent, shadows crawled, and the blood of the past demanded to be seen. And so anyone who dared to listen would hear not only the story of how an axe split lives apart, but of how revenge never ended, how injustice created a wound that spread like poison, and how in the end, the greatest terror was not the crime itself, but the realization that the house was still alive, waiting, feeding, and reminding the world that some sins are too heavy to bury, that power when misused leaves scars deeper than murder, and that sometimes the dead return not to find peace, but to ensure the living never forget. The Axe Murder House did not rise overnight as a monster born of one crime. It grew out of soil that was already poisoned by human greed and silent cruelty, for long before the screams that painted its walls. The house was part of a town that appeared gentle on the surface but carried dark undercurrents, where neighbors smiled yet kept grudges like sharpened blades, where whispers of class, wealth, and bloodline decided who mattered and who did not. And in that hierarchy stood the family whose fate would carve the legend into history, a family who lived with modest means but honest hearts, whose children's laughter filled the air and whose kindness left traces even in those who envied them. But beneath that laughter ran a quiet stream of discontent, for not everyone in the town believed goodness was strength. Some believed power was only real when it was feared, and that belief simmered in the hearts of men who thought themselves untouchable. And so when the murders came, they were not merely an act of violence but a reflection of a larger wound, a social injustice that allowed the powerful to control the narrative, bury questions, and let the guilty slip into shadow while the innocent were lowered into the earth. And in those early days after the blood dried, the town gathered in stunned silence, speaking of tragedy while avoiding the truth, because to face it would mean admitting complicity. It would mean shattering the illusion that their streets were safe, their leaders fair, and their God watching. But the house knew, the walls knew, every plank soaked in the cries of that night, and they did not forgive. For each creak in the floor was not age but anger. Each groan of the wood was not weather but the echo of children calling out for justice that never came. And as the years passed, the house became a silent accuser, its windows staring like eyes that had seen betrayal. And people said that at dusk, when the last light faded, the air around the house thickened, as though unseen hands pressed against your chest and demanded you feel what they felt. Demanded you hear what the law refused to speak. Demanded you witness what history tried to erase. For the crime was not solved, the killer was never punished, and the world moved on while the victims remained trapped, their story frozen in that moment of horror. And so revenge became not a choice but a force, growing stronger with every retelling, binding itself to the walls until the house was no longer wood and stone but a living curse. A curse that did not settle for scaring wanderers but sought to make the world see the injustice it had ignored. And in that demand lay the shocking twist. For those who entered the house expecting ghosts found something far more terrifying. They found visions of their own hidden sins. They felt judgments whispered not only for the crime of the past, but for the injustices they themselves had caused or ignored. And so the house became a mirror of guilt, dragging out the shadows people carried within, punishing them with truths they thought buried, leaving them shaken, sometimes broken, sometimes never the same again. And thus the story of the Axe Murder House was never simply about an unsolved crime. It was about what happens when injustice festers, when revenge refuses to die, and when power twists itself into something that can haunt generations. And the introduction of its tale was not the night of blood alone, but the unveiling of how easily society looks away until the walls themselves rise to speak, forcing the living to remember what they tried so hard to forget. The story of the Axe Murder House truly began on that fateful summer night when the world outside slept under the heavy cloak of darkness, unaware that inside the house a storm was rising that would tear apart not only a family but the illusion of peace that the town clung to. For in those late hours when lamps were dimmed and the last echoes of laughter faded into silence, a shadow moved with purpose, carrying not only the weight of an axe but the poison of rage, jealousy, and a hunger for power. And though many would later argue about the identity of that shadow, the truth that lived within the house was clearer than any testimony, for the walls remembered every step, every pause of breath, every tightening of fingers around the wooden handle as the figure crept closer to where innocence lay sleeping. And the first strike was not against flesh alone but against the fragile balance of justice itself, a blow that split trust, shattered safety, and awakened something that would never return to rest. Because as the children's cries were muffled by the next blows, as the mother's hands reached out in vain to shield, as the father fell under the weight of steel and betrayal, the house absorbed not just blood but despair, a despair that thickened into something unearthly, binding itself to the beams, curling into the air, clinging to every corner until the house itself became a witness and a weapon. And when the killer slipped into the night with silence for a cloak, leaving behind broken bodies and a community about to fracture, the true story of the Axe Murder House began, not in the death of the family but in what followed. For by morning the town gathered at the gate, faces pale with disbelief, voices hushed with fear. Yet behind their tears lay the seeds of denial, because to accept that one of their own could have committed such savagery was to admit that evil lived not in distant lands, but within their very streets. And so while the ground was still wet with the memory of the crime, whispers began, whispers that twisted truth, shifted blame, and silenced questions. And soon officials stepped in, not with the fire of justice but with the cold machinery of politics, eager to protect reputations, to shield the powerful from suspicion, to preserve the image of a town that claimed innocence while blood soaked its soil. And in that silence the killer found refuge, walking free under the same sun that should have exposed him, while the victims were buried under prayers that felt hollow, their names carved in stone while their voices cried out in the house, demanding to be heard, demanding that justice be done. But as months turned to years, the world forgot. Newspapers printed stories that faded. Investigators turned their eyes elsewhere. Neighbors locked their doors and pretended the screams had never echoed. And in that forgetting lay the deepest wound. for injustice is not merely the absence of law but the active betrayal of truth. And the axe murder house, with every creak of its boards, reminded the world that forgetting was a crime of its own, and so it began to breathe with anger, to whisper to those who entered, to drag them into the nightmare of that night, showing them the faces of the slain, forcing them to hear the thud of the axe, the cries that were cut short, the silence that followed. And for those who stayed long enough, the house revealed something even darker. Visions not only of the murders, but of the corruption that allowed the murderer to walk free. The deals whispered in offices, the evidence hidden, the testimonies ignored, the powerful shielding themselves while the powerless carried the blame. And in these visions the house delivered its revenge, not through the hands of men, but through the torment of memory, punishing the guilty not with prison but with madness, punishing the innocent not with death but with fear, ensuring that no one who crossed its threshold could escape untouched. For the house had become more than a tomb. It was now a force, a vessel of rage that demanded balance, a place where the living were made to confront the shadows of their own souls. And in that confrontation many broke, some running into the night screaming, others never speaking of what they saw, others vanishing into silence as if swallowed by the same darkness that took the family. And still the house stood year after year, its windows staring like unblinking eyes, its door a mouth waiting to swallow the next intruder, because it knew time would bring seekers, investigators, skeptics, and thrill hunters, all of whom thought they could master fear, yet all of whom discovered that the greatest terror was not the story of what happened, but the realization that the story was still happening, that the crime never ended, that the injustice still bled, and that the revenge had only just begun. The axe murder house did not rest after the first waves of grief settled into the soil of the town. Instead, it grew hungrier, its silence stretching into decades, its shadows pressing harder against those who dared to come close. And while the murders themselves remained unsolved, the truth of the town's reaction festered in the air like a poison that refused to fade. For when officials failed to hold the guilty accountable, they also failed the innocent who had been slain, and the community, instead of demanding justice, chose the comfort of ignorance, turning away from the house, speaking of it only in whispers, as if silence could erase blood, but silence became fuel, feeding the house with more than sorrow, feeding it with rage, until every night the air around it grew heavier, carrying with it the cries of children that only the guilty could hear. And those who passed by late after dusk swore that they felt the pull of unseen eyes watching, judging, reminding them that injustice once committed is never forgotten. And soon the house drew not only locals but strangers, journalists chasing stories, preachers looking for proof of sin, skeptics armed with logic, and wanderers chasing thrills. But none of them left unchanged. For while they came seeking answers, they found themselves entangled in something greater than fear. They became vessels for the house to speak, stumbling out with words not their own, trembling as they described visions of that night. The sound of the axe rising and falling, the scream of a mother shielding her children, the heavy breathing of a man who knew power had granted him protection. And in these visions the house delivered not only horror, but judgment, showing how every man and woman carried shadows of their own, how the injustice of the family's death was only a reflection of the larger injustices that scarred society, how prejudice, greed, and silence allowed monsters to walk freely while the weak were buried. And this was the shocking power of the house, that it did not simply haunt with ghosts, but with truth, dragging into the open the sins of the living, forcing those inside its walls to confront the parts of themselves they wished to hide. For one man who entered left raving about a secret betrayal he had buried for decades. Another woman staggered out weeping over a child she had abandoned long ago. And yet another fell to his knees, begging forgiveness from no one the living could see. And so the legend grew, not because of the murders alone, but because the house became a mirror that no one wished to face, a mirror carved from blood and sorrow, a mirror that reflected the worst of human nature. And the more people came, the more the house fed, taking strength from each new confession, growing darker with each secret it unearthed, until the line between the original crime and the lives of those who dared to enter blurred completely, and some began to whisper that the house was no longer bound to its walls at all, that those who mocked it, carried pieces of its curse back into their homes, hearing footsteps in hallways, finding children's laughter echoing in empty rooms, seeing shadows shift across mirrors when no one stood there, and these stories spread like wildfire, making the Axe Murder House not just a relic of one unsolved tragedy, but a living terror that stretched beyond its yard, a terror that seemed to choose its victims not by chance but by guilt, by the weight of injustice they carried in their own hearts. And so the house grew in power not because of what it contained, but because of what it revealed, feeding on the silence of the world, thriving on the refusal to confront the truth. And in this way, the revenge of the slain family became eternal, not limited to the man who swung the axe, but directed at all who dared to look away, all who chose silence over courage, all who placed reputation above justice. For the house had learned what the living never did, that true power is not in hiding sins, but in forcing them into the open. And with each passing year, it became more ruthless in this task, stripping the masks from the faces of those who entered, leaving them raw, exposed, and haunted, until they understood that the terror of the Axe Murder House was not the blood that once soaked its floors, but the truth that no sin, no betrayal, no injustice can ever remain buried forever. For the house itself had become the grave where secrets came alive, and it would not rest until every shadow was dragged into light. As the years stretched into decades, the Axe Murder House refused to fade into memory, and instead wove itself tighter into the fabric of the town's identity. A wound that refused to heal, a scar that throbbed beneath every festival smile and Sunday prayer. For while people tried to build their lives around it, they could never escape its gaze. And those who lived nearest swore that the house did not simply sit in silence, but listened, learning the rhythms of their lives, waiting for moments of weakness to strike. And strike it did not with blades or fire, but with whispers, shadows, and visions that burrowed into the mind. Visions that were not always of the murdered family, but sometimes of the secrets each person carried. For the house had grown beyond a tomb and had become a vessel of judgment, pulling from every visitor the darkness they thought hidden, punishing them with sleepless nights, forcing them to confess. And in this way, the story of the Axe Murder House transformed from a single crime into a legend of reckoning, a place where society itself was put on trial. And the more the world changed, the more the house adapted, feeding on new injustices, drawing in those who sought to exploit its fame. For filmmakers, writers, and tourists came in droves, their cameras and notebooks ready to turn tragedy into profit. And though many mocked the legends for entertainment value, none left without some mark, some lingering image of a child's cry, some sudden shiver in a hotel room miles away, some nightmare that repeated until the line between imagination and reality blurred. And while skeptics called it hysteria, those who truly listened knew it was more. They knew the house was not satisfied with being a relic, but was expanding its reach, tying itself to the conscience of anyone who dared to treat its story as mere spectacle. And so revenge became layered, not only for the murdered family, but for every betrayal of their memory, every exploitation of their pain, every attempt to profit from their silence. And this form of vengeance was subtle yet merciless. For some who mocked the house would return home only to find their lives unraveling, marriages collapsing under sudden confessions, careers falling apart after hidden scandals surfaced, friendships breaking when secrets clawed to the surface. And it seemed the house had decided that if the world refused to expose the truth, then it would do so itself, dragging sin into daylight, shredding illusions of innocence. And the town, once complicit in silence, now found itself trapped in a web of fear. For though they avoided the house, they could not avoid its reach. And many whispered that their own ancestors' silence was the reason the curse thrived, that their grandparents' refusal to demand justice had tied the blood of the murdered to their own bloodlines, binding them to a debt that could never be repaid. And whether true or not, the belief itself became a chain, pulling them deeper into dread. And the shocking twist that began to emerge was that the house no longer cared who the original killer was, no longer sought one man's punishment, for its rage had grown beyond one figure and had become a force against all who carried guilt in their hearts, transforming from the site of one family's destruction into a living court that judged humanity itself, And in this court there was no defense, no plea, no mercy, only the relentless weight of memory pressing down until even the strongest bent beneath it. And so the legend grew darker, no longer the tale of an unsolved crime, but of a house that had awakened into something that blurred the line between justice and revenge, something that showed the living the cost of silence, the price of turning away, and the truth that the dead, once betrayed, do not rest quietly but rise, demanding balance in ways that no law, no authority, and no church could contain. The Axe Murder House stood through storms, wars, and generations, its frame weathered yet unbroken, as though the rage within kept the wood from collapsing. And while the town aged around it, building new roads, new schools, and new churches, the house remained unchanged, stubborn in its silence, heavy with its curse, and every decade new faces came to test its legend, some with courage, some with arrogance, some with desperate hope that maybe by entering they could understand what had happened that night. But none found clarity, only more questions, for the house never gave answers. It gave punishments, twisting dreams into terrors, dragging the living through scenes that felt real enough to scar. And more than once visitors left with eyes hollow, voices trembling, unable to explain the visions of betrayal, the cold hand of a child that grasped their wrist, the sudden flash of an axe glinting in the dark. And while outsiders thought it was superstition or hysteria, the locals knew better, for they had lived too long under its gaze, had heard too many stories of those who entered laughing but emerged broken, and they whispered that the house did not just haunt but chose, selecting victims who carried unspoken guilt, feeding on the rot of their secrets until it grew strong enough to pull those secrets into the open. And in that way it punished not only individuals but entire bloodlines, reminding the town that silence had consequences, that the night of murder was not a single act, but the birth of a curse that their own ancestors had allowed by turning their faces away. And so children were raised with warnings to never go near the house. Yet temptation always won, for the more it was forbidden, the more it drew them in. And each generation saw its share of reckless souls stepping across the threshold only to carry the curse back into their homes, where footsteps echoed in empty halls, where doors slammed without wind, where mirrors reflected not the living but the eyes of the dead. And it became clear that the house was not merely confined to its land, but was a seed of corruption that could be carried anywhere. And as this truth spread, it forced the town into a deeper silence. For to admit it aloud was to accept that their entire community was bound to the crime, chained by the injustice their leaders had buried, and still officials avoided it, calling the house folklore, calling the stories nonsense. But their denials rang hollow, for even they were not spared. Some waking in the night to hear children's laughter in their offices, some seeing blood smear across their walls before vanishing, some finding their names whispered in the wind as though the dead themselves had placed judgment on them, and still they refused to acknowledge it. But the house did not need acknowledgement. It thrived on denial, each unspoken truth a piece of fuel, each buried injustice another brick in its power. And as time marched forward, its hunger grew, no longer satisfied with punishing individuals but reaching for larger vengeance, feeding on the sins of society itself, on corruption, on cruelty, on silence wherever it existed, until those who studied it realized with horror that the house had become more than haunted. It had become aware, an intelligence shaped by rage and sorrow, a force that blurred the line between spirit and structure, a living entity that chose its prey with precision, punishing the guilty while dragging the innocent into its web as collateral. And the shocking power twist that emerged was that the house no longer belonged to the past at all. It belonged to the present, shaping itself around the sins of every new generation, adapting, expanding, feeding, and ensuring that the story of that night would never fade into history but would remain alive, demanding that the living confront not only what was done in that house but what they themselves allowed in their own time. For the house had become the voice of the silenced, the hand of revenge, and the endless reminder that injustice is never buried. It only waits, and when it rises with a fury that no one can escape. The Axe Murder House reached a point where it was no longer a relic of a single unsolved crime but a living paradox, a place where past and present folded into each other until visitors lost track of time itself, stepping across its threshold only to feel the years melt away, hearing the creak of floorboards that sounded not old but immediate, the sharp intake of breath as though someone stood just behind them, the sudden metallic scent of blood heavy in the air though no stain could be seen. And it was in these moments that the house revealed its most terrifying truth, that the murders were not finished, that the crime repeated itself in endless cycles, replaying for every witness, binding them to the same terror that had frozen the family that night. And while many collapsed under the weight of these visions, those who endured long enough saw something worse. They saw not only the faceless killer but the reflection of society itself standing behind him, a reflection of every neighbor who looked away, every leader who silenced evidence, every official who buried truth. And in that revelation the house showed its true nature, for it was no longer about revenge against one man but revenge against the structure of injustice itself, against the cycle of silence and corruption that had allowed the murderer to walk free. And this power was shocking because it meant the house had become more than haunted. It had become a judge, jury, and executioner, delivering punishments not with axes but with truth, stripping bare the souls of those who entered, forcing them to confront not just ghosts, but their own sins, their own betrayals, their own failures to protect the innocent. And in this merciless tribunal no one was spared, not the curious, not the skeptical, not even the innocent who carried the weight of ancestors who had chosen silence. And as these revelations spread beyond the town into the wider world, the house became a symbol of dread, a place where journalists who sought sensational stories instead found their own scandals unearthed, where thrill-seekers who mocked the dead returned with eyes hollow from visions of their worst memories, where preachers left shaken after hearing their own prayers echoed back to them in voices that mocked their hypocrisy. And the more it fed, the stronger it grew, until even those who never set foot near it felt its shadow. For the curse did not need walls anymore. It traveled in whispers, in memories, in the retelling of the story, and each retelling gave it new strength. Each listener became a witness, each witness another vessel for the rage of the murdered. And so the legend of the Axe Murder House spread not as folklore but as infection, a haunting carried in words, in silence, in guilt. And the final revelation of its power was the most terrifying of all. For the house no longer sought only to remind but to continue, no longer satisfied with showing the world the cost of silence. It now sought to create new cycles, planting itself wherever injustice thrived, wherever revenge burned unanswered. And in this way the Axe Murder House was no longer confined to the small town where it began, but had become a force without boundaries, a house without walls, a curse without end, reminding every generation that when blood cries for justice and none is given, that cry does not fade, it multiplies, it grows, it waits, and when it rises again it does so with fury that no living soul can contain. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of crimson that mirrored the blood long spilled within its walls, the Axe Murder House stood silently yet more alive than ever, its windows reflecting a world that had tried and failed to forget. And in that silence lay the final reckoning. For the house had waited not for decades alone, but for the moment when the living could finally comprehend the depth of its power, the weight of its vengeance, and the truth that some acts of injustice are so profound they transcend time, reaching across generations to exact punishment not only upon the guilty, but upon every heart that allowed silence, every mind that hid from truth, every soul that ignored cries of the innocent. And as the wind swept through the broken beams, carrying whispers of children who would never grow, mothers who had been struck down while trying to protect, fathers who had fallen under the weight of betrayal, the air seemed thick with a presence both terrifying and undeniable, a presence that told those who listened that closure would not come through law, through confession, through recognition of guilt alone. For the house had absorbed these attempts for decades and spat them out like empty promises. Instead, the closure it demanded was understanding, comprehension of the cost of injustice, and acknowledgement that revenge is not the act of one person, but the echo of the wronged multiplied through time. And as the town watched from afar, Trembling at the silhouette of the house outlined against the darkening sky, they realized that this was not a place to visit, to exploit, to mock, but a living reminder that some crimes, some betrayals, some acts of cruelty cannot be ignored without consequence, that the power of those wronged does not die with their bodies, that the dead can and will rise in memory, in judgment, in fury, shaping the fates of the living in ways that justice often refuses to. And as the night deepened, figures began to move within the house, shadows flickering, not with the movement of wind but with purpose, purpose born from rage, sorrow, and an unyielding demand for recognition. And those who had entered before and survived swore they could feel the pull of the house even from miles away, as if the walls themselves had reached through the earth to touch their hearts. And the shocking truth that no one had understood before became clear. The house's power was not in the axe, not in the murders, not in the terror it inspired, but in its ability to expose the rot of human nature, to show how easily society can turn its back on innocence, how effortlessly silence can allow evil to flourish, and how vengeance, when denied by law, becomes something greater, something unstoppable, something that exists beyond mortal understanding. And as the moon rose high, silvering the weathered boards and casting elongated shadows across the lawn, the house seemed to pulse with life, the past and present intermingling in a final symphony of terror and justice. And then the ultimate twist revealed itself. For those who entered that night and thought they would leave with only fear now saw the end game. The house had gathered not just witnesses but arbiters, forcing the living to weigh their own morality against the horrors it had collected. And in that judgment, many understood too late that they were no longer mere observers but participants, bound by acknowledgement, by memory, by the unshakable knowledge that the world could not simply ignore the cries of the wronged. And as dawn approached, the house fell into a deceptive calm, its windows dark yet watchful, its doors closed yet ready, the silence heavy with promise that the story was never truly over, that every act of courage, every confession, every recognition of past wrongs became part of its power. And for those who finally left, their hearts still racing, minds seared with visions that could not be erased, they carried the ultimate lesson, that justice denied becomes a force beyond human control, that revenge is patient, cunning, and eternal, and that the axe murder house was no longer simply a place of tragedy, but a living testament, a monument to the consequences of indifference, the enduring power of the wronged, and the inescapable truth that some evils, once unleashed, cannot be silenced, cannot be contained, and cannot ever be forgotten. And as the town slowly breathed under the new light of day, the house waited, always waiting, for the next generation to come too close, for the next secret to be buried too deeply, for the next act of injustice to demand its reckoning. And in that waiting lay the final horror, the final closure. For the axe murder house had completed its transformation from house to legend, to force of nature. And now it was eternal, unforgettable, and unstoppable. A haunting that did not merely scare but taught, punished, and endured, leaving every soul who dared to glimpse its truth with an understanding they could never unlearn, a memory they could never escape, and a fear that would linger long after they had left, echoing through their lives like the relentless cry of the dead who demanded, and would always demand, that justice be seen, felt, and reckoned with. And in that eternal reckoning the house found its perfect closure, not in the silence of the guilty or the despair of the innocent, but in the unbreakable knowledge that some stories do not end, some vengeance does not fade, and some houses do not merely stand. They endure. They remember and they wait.